Something extraordinary happened today, something that has shaken the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and the entire world of science and education. The president of Stanford, a university that consistently ranks in the top 3 in the world, resigned. Mark Tessier-Levine, who has led Stanford for 7 years, sent out a letter announcing his departure at the end of next month. It comes after months of explosive reporting by an 18-year-old student journalist who spent his freshman year digging into accusations that the president of his university supervised falsified research and allowed it to be published. Joining us live now, Stanford sophomore-to-be and investigations editor of the student newspaper, the Stanford Daily, Theo Baker. Theo, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm sure it's a really busy day for you today because Tessier-Levine's resignation really caps a stunning set of events that you put into motion last November when you wrote the first article about potential missteps in the work done by his lab before he came to Stanford. What were those allegations?
Yeah, so it's important to note that, there were whisperings of something regarding alleged or manipulated research that Tessier-Levine had published that were floating around the internet for years. They were hiding in scientific forums, they were hiding on blog posts, but they'd never been reported, even while Stanford, he assumed the post of Stanford's president, where he directs an institution with more than $8.9 billion in yearly funding, higher than 11 US states. So these allegations revolved around the idea that images that were published in his papers had been manipulated and photoshopped to show results that they did not actually represent.
All right, and in that first November article, I think you published that image, which also you guys looked at, had forensic scientists work with you on that. So we're going to go ahead and pull that up. I think this is too much for the layman and myself to understand. But bottom line, I think what you were able to glean from talking to lots of scientists is that this data was not correct when it was submitted to publications, right? And that somebody at the top of the lab, whose name is on the lab, should have noticed. Is that what they said?
Yeah, so as you can imagine from a story that has been progressing over the months, there are a lot of different allegations that have at this point come out of the woodwork. The original story focused on a number of different errors, like the one that you can see on your screen here. That is what forensic image analysts call a type 1 duplication, where the same blot is literally just replicated and put in another space. Some of the manipulations are a lot more tricky to spot. Little bits and pieces are spliced together to make it look like there are different results. All told, there are about a dozen papers on which Tessier-Levine is a co-author, a named co-author, that seem to have manipulated imagery. For 5 of those, he's the principal author, and he's now agreed, as a result of this report that also led to him stepping down, to retract or issue lengthy corrections to all of these very widely cited papers. And that's something that definitely wouldn't have happened had our reporting not brought this into the fore and Stanford decided to investigate itself.
I want to ask you what Stanford's reaction was initially, because you published dozens of articles on this subject, and it sounds like that there was some prodding before they put together this board to kind of lead the investigation and then eventually hire an outside firm. All those things were not a given from the start, right?
Yeah, nothing about this was given. Certainly I might not have expected it to play out the way that it did. One thing that we still remain shocked at is that the university did open an investigation within a day, which was rather remarkable. That's not something Stanford has a real history of doing. That investigation obviously was sort of fraught with its own issues. We revealed that one of the people they appointed to investigate him had an $18 million investment in his company. And so they hired a lawyer to do the review instead. Our recent reporting suggests that they might not have had access to certain sources because they would not guarantee them anonymity despite non-disclosure agreements. So that in and of itself has been a big part of the story, is Stanford's reaction to this and how, they have decided to dig into the research of, the top person at one of America's most premier research institutions.
So finally, that outside law firm, they released their findings 2 days ago, and what was the ultimate conclusion?
Yeah, so the report just came out publicly this morning, and it was somewhat remarkable for us to read. It concluded that Tessier-Levine had inculcated a culture across 2 decades and 3 different institutions where he rewarded the winners and he punished the losers, and that resulted in a number of manipulated research data to be published in his name. Now, the report did not conclude that he directly manipulated things, but it did conclude that for 2 decades, he failed to correct the scientific record despite being made aware of allegations a number of different times. And that was really remarkable to read, especially in a report that was sanctioned and sponsored by Stanford's own Board of Trustees.
Can I just ask you to dive in a little more deeply into that conclusion of rewarding the winners, those who produce positive results, if you will, and marginalizing the losers, meaning those postdocs who maybe didn't. Do you think that culture is bigger than one man?
Oh, without a doubt. And that's actually, I mean, I think if we're talking about this story as something that can be taken to, mean things that are greater than any one individual man, I really hope that this is a big part of that conversation. Scientific integrity, who takes responsibility for errors, who, is pushing people or not necessarily providing the safeguards to prevent things like this happening. There are a lot of senior researchers in science who put their names on papers they didn't write, they didn't research, and they really didn't have all that much to do with. And, they take credit for it when it is convenient for them. And if errors arise, sometimes they try to disclaim those. And so I hope that this can open up a much broader conversation about who takes responsibility when things like this happen in science. Unfortunately, we've seen a few instances of that this summer. Francesca Gino over at Harvard, and obviously the Dan Ariely stuff also coming out at a similar time. So the idea that research integrity is being taken more seriously now, and hopefully that our reporting has contributed to that, I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
And we want to be fair. Tessier-Levine's letter, we want to show part of it today that he sent to the Stanford community. He says the panel did not find that I engaged in research misconduct regarding the 12 papers reviewed, nor did it find I had knowledge of or was reckless regarding research misconduct in my lab. The panel's report identifies some areas where I should have done better, and I accept the report's conclusions, again, mirroring that maybe closer supervision would have been warranted. But I want to ask you, during all this time, I'm sure you went to Tessier-Levine multiple times. Did he ever talk to you?
No, never. And that has been, consistently something that has been a frustration for me, because obviously my primary concern for all of this has been trying to put together the most complete portrait that I can. And when his side of the story is one that he chooses not to tell us, or he chooses not to answer questions about, it makes it even harder to understand or report his perspective. Tessier-Levine has dodged a number of questions, and it is fair to say that his narrative throughout the last series of months has changed dramatically. At first, his very initial defense that he reiterated multiple times said that the alleged manipulation in his papers had no bearing on the findings of the studies. Obviously, since now several of them are being retracted, that is not true. He also had claimed a number of things that have since been somewhat walked back. For example, he said that the data were reproducible about one of these papers that's in question. And actually, Genentech, the company where he worked, confirmed that he knew even before it was published that the data were not reproducible. And even the Stanford report, he had said publicly about that same paper that it is totally inappropriate to retract or correct it. And the report that Stanford issued says, no, it should be retracted or corrected with a lengthy correction.
You said these rumors have been swirling about scientific forums for many years. Was this something Stanford had known about during the time of their hiring process to find the next president before he was hired? I mean, did they hire him knowing this was out there, and Stanford being a leading scientific institution and research university?